Three executive orders signed by Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu aim to transform the gas and the oil and gas sector of the economy, with gas being the country's best option for attaining energy stability. Oyeyemi Oke, a partner at AO2 Law, joins me to unpack the details of the executive orders. Oyeyemi, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Obviously, good news for the energy sector, the oil and gas sector. But walk us through what are the most important elements of these executive orders that we need to pay attention to? I know that it provides incentives for value chain development, etc. But I mean, what do we need to know?
I guess let me save the best for last, which is the executive order on incentives for gas. Let's look at the other two executive orders briefly before we look at what it portends for gas. For the executive order on contracting, essentially seeks to reduce the contracting cycle. Typically, what we see perhaps from what I call RFQ stage up until contract execution, typically it takes about maybe 2 to 3 years. But the executive order is looking to reducing this cycle to about 6 months. Now, in terms of contracting threshold, what we typically have is that, for example, under the JOAs for the joint ventures, the contracting threshold in terms of the operator having to enter into perhaps a bid cycle. The threshold had always been perhaps around $1 million to $2 million. This has been increased to $10 million under the executive order, which is good, which means that essentially contracting can be done faster. And I think a significant element of the executive order on contracting has to do with the provisions on what we call deemed approval, which essentially says that if the operator does not get the requisite consent or approval from the government authorities, there are provisions on deemed approval, which is in tandem with perhaps the provisions of the Business Facilitation Act. Now, if you go to the other executive order, which has to do with local content, I think the summary of that is that essentially government no longer wants intermediaries that do not have capacity, local intermediaries that do not have capacity to be able to deliver the job. So essentially there should be demonstrable local capacity to execute work, not only just having a shelf company for this purpose of satisfying local content requirements. Right. And essentially
Now finish your thoughts.
Yeah. So essentially, in order to give life to that executive order, what will happen is that the Content Monitoring Board would develop guidelines. But just a quick point before we take the next question, Esther. On the gas side, I think the incentives granted there are quite extensive and quite encouraging. Right, you would have situations whereby, a situation whereby we would have gas tax allowance or gas tax credit, depending on when the projects come for non-associated gas projects.
Now, this all sounds great on paper. I mean, especially around reducing timelines around contracting timelines, etc. But like I said, it looks good on paper. In practice, how easy, how workable is this going to be, and what will be key in ensuring that this can work on the ground?
I don't see a challenge in terms of how to get this off the ground in terms of implementation. Text in the executive order already mandates the relevant agencies, whether the Content Board, whether the Nigerian Upstream Investment Service, Management Services, including the FRS, in order to give force and life to the provisions of the executive order. I don't see a challenge. However, my view would be that there is a vital step that needs to be taken to put what I will call, or to have what I will call a bulletproof position with regards to this policy directive. And that step should be that apart from just having executive orders, my views are that these executive orders should be legislated upon so that we don't have a conflict between policy directive and what the law is.